The smell of the church kitchen on Wednesday evenings was like entering a different world, a space where the ordinary rules of hunger and fullness, of inside and outside, seemed suspended. It was a smell that began to announce itself as soon as you walked through the side door of the church, the door that led not to the sanctuary, but to the basement where the real work of the church happened. The smell was a combination of things: onions and celery being chopped, broth simmering in large pots, bread baking in ovens, the particular tang of vinegar used in collard greens, the slight burn smell of something being stirred too vigorously in a hot pan. I was 9 years old when I started going to the church kitchen on Wednesday nights to help with the dinner that was served to anyone in the neighborhood who wanted to come. My mother had not asked me if I wanted to go. She had simply told me that I was old enough now to help, and we would go together. I understood this not as a question, but as a statement of fact. And I understood that going to the church kitchen was something that was important, something that was part of how the church took care of the neighborhood, and something that I was now old enough to be a part of. The kitchen itself was not large, but it was organized in a way that allowed many people to work in it at once without getting too much in each other's way. There were long tables where vegetables were prepared. There was a large gas stove with 6 burners, any or all of which might be in use during the evening. There were ovens, 2 of them, and they were usually both being used. There were sinks deep enough to accommodate large pots and counters covered with bowls and measuring cups and cutting boards. The walls were white, or had once been white, and were now marked by years of cooking, by the inevitable splashes and stains that came from the work of feeding large numbers of people. The women who worked in the kitchen on Wednesday nights were the backbone of the church in a way that was not formally acknowledged but was understood by everyone. They were the wives of deacons, the wives of ushers, the wives of the pastor, and they were also women who simply came because they believed in the work. Some of them had been cooking in that kitchen for 20 years or more. They knew each other's rhythms, knew how to work together without much conversation, knew how to manage the enormous task of preparing food for anywhere from 50 to 100 people, with a budget that was never quite enough, and equipment that was older than any of them. Mama joined a group of women who were preparing vegetables. There was no instruction. She simply took her place at the table and began working. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, who knew how to chop an onion into uniform pieces, who knew that celery should be cleaned before cutting, who knew how to keep the knife sharp enough to do the work without destroying the vegetables. The other women nodded to her. They did not need to talk much. They had done this work together for years, or they knew women who had done this work together for years, and the knowledge passed down was more about feeling than about instruction. I was given a task that seemed simple but required more attention than I expected. I was to snap green beans. The beans had come from somewhere. I did not know and did not think to ask where they came from. They were piled in a large colander, and my job was to break each bean in half, putting the 2 halves into a separate bowl. It seemed like a straightforward task, but it required that I snap each bean in exactly the right place to break it cleanly. If I broke it too close to one end, I would be wasting bean. If I bent it rather than snapping it, it would not be ready for cooking. I worked on the beans for what felt like hours. My fingers began to hurt. The green stain from the beans accumulated on my skin. The pile did not seem to diminish as much as it should have, but I kept working, and I did not complain, because I understood without being told that complaining was not part of what this work was about. This work was about care. This work was about feeding people. This work was about the community. My sore fingers were not as important as the green beans that had to be prepared. At some point, Mrs. Wilson, who was the pastor's wife, came over and checked my work. She picked up a handful of the beans I had snapped and examined them. She did not say anything critical. She simply said, "That's good work," and moved on. But her approval settled something in me. The work I was doing mattered. I was doing it right. I was part of something that mattered. The rhythm of the kitchen was different from the rhythm of anywhere else I had ever been. It was organized, but not in the way that a classroom was organized. There were no instructions, no checking of boxes, no measuring against a standard. Instead, There was a kind of intuitive organization that came from experience and from a shared understanding of what needed to happen. Women moved between stations. Food moved from being raw to being cooked. The smell grew more complex as more things came together. Mama worked without talking much, but she was not isolated. Women would call out to her, ask her a question, hand her something, receive something from her. The communication was minimal but constant. An eyebrow raised in question, a nod in response, a hand reaching out to pass something along. It was a language that had been developed over years of working together, that required no explanation because the meaning was understood. Around 7 o'clock, people began to arrive for dinner. The serving line was set up in the same basement, but in a separate area from where the cooking happened. The food was transferred from pots and pans to serving dishes. Plates and utensils were laid out. The women who had been cooking moved into the role of servers, and other women took over some of the serving tasks. I was given the job of helping to clear tables after people had eaten. The people who came to the dinner were a mix. Some of them were members of the church who came regularly for the fellowship and the food. Some of them were people from the neighborhood who did not go to church but knew that the dinner was open to anyone. Some of them were elderly people who seemed to live somewhat isolated lives and valued the opportunity to sit with others and eat. Some of them were families with young children. Some of them were single men. The dinner was not fancy. The food was simple: fried chicken, collard greens, green beans, cornbread, rice and gravy, sometimes a fish entree. But it was made with care, and it was served with respect. What I noticed, clearing tables, was the way people ate. They ate slowly. They savored the food. They talked while they ate, or sat in quiet companionship with whoever was at their table. This was not food that people rushed through. This was food that meant something to them. I understood, without being told, that for some of these people, this meal was important in ways that went beyond the simple fact of being fed. This was a place where they belonged. This was a place where they were cared for. I also noticed the way the women moved around the dining area. They were attentive without being intrusive. If someone's glass was empty, one of the women would come by with a pitcher and refill it. If someone looked uncomfortable or lonely, a woman would sit down at the table and talk with them for a minute. The care was constant but quiet. It was not showy. It was not meant to be noticed. But it was absolutely present. After everyone had eaten and the serving line was closed, the work of cleaning began. This was the part of the evening where I worked most actively. I helped carry dishes into the kitchen, where they were washed in the large sinks. I helped dry dishes and put them away. I helped wipe down tables. The work was repetitive and tedious, but it was also necessary, and everyone helped. The same women who had been cooking now cleaned, and gradually the kitchen was restored to its original state, ready for the next time. As I continued to go to the church kitchen on Wednesday nights, sometimes with Mama, sometimes helping in different ways as I got older and stronger, I began to understand something about what the church was really doing. It was not primarily about religion, though religion was the framework. It was about maintaining community. It was about ensuring that people were fed and cared for. It was about creating a space where people belonged. It was about the transmission of care from one generation to the next. The women who worked in the kitchen were teaching me something that could not have been taught in words. They were teaching me about what it meant to care for people you did not necessarily know well. They were teaching me that care was not a feeling, but an action, something you did with your hands and your time and your attention. They were teaching me that the work itself was valuable, not because anyone would give you credit for it or pay you for it, but because the work was necessary and it mattered. I also noticed as I got older that the church kitchen was a place where certain conversations happened. As I worked, I would overhear fragments of talk between the women. They would talk about their own lives, about children, about worries, about challenges. But they would talk in a way that was both personal and not personal, sharing what was happening without self-pity, without asking for advice unless they asked explicitly. The kitchen was a place where women could be honest with each other in a way that maybe they could not be in other contexts. And while they were being honest, they were also doing the work of caring for the community. The two things were not separate, they happened together. One particular evening, when I must have been around 11 or 12, I became aware of a conversation that was happening while I worked. There was a young woman who had recently started coming to the dinners. I had heard fragments of her story from the women. She had recently left a difficult situation, was trying to rebuild her life, was living in a temporary housing situation while she figured out what came next. The women in the kitchen treated her the way they treated everyone, with respect and with the expectation that she was capable and strong, but they also made small accommodations for her. They gave her food to take home. They sometimes offered her work, small jobs for pay that helped her earn a little money. They included her in conversations in a way that made it clear she belonged. What I understood watching this unfold was that the church kitchen was not just feeding people. It was supporting people in rebuilding their lives. It was maintaining a space where people could gather and not be judged. It was providing not just food, but also dignity and connection, and the message that you mattered, that you were part of a community that cared about you. I also understood gradually something about my mother that I had not fully seen before. My mother was not someone who talked a lot. She was not someone who called attention to herself. But in the church kitchen, I could see that she was respected, that other women looked to her, that her presence mattered. She was part of a network of women who were doing important work, and that work gave her a kind of authority and respect that I had not associated with her before. At home, she was busy and occupied with the work of running the household, of taking care of my siblings and me. But in the church kitchen, I could see that she was also part of something larger, something that extended beyond her own family. As I got older, I took on more responsibility in the kitchen. By the time I was 13 or 14, I was helping to manage the serving line, helping to make some of the dishes, beginning to understand not just the work, but the skill that was required. I was learning how to cook in a real way, not in the isolated way you might learn to make one dish, but in the context of cooking for large numbers of people, of managing time and resources, of making sure that the quality was good even when you were using limited budget and limited equipment. But more importantly, I was learning something about community, about service, about the way that care was maintained in a community through the deliberate action of women who came together and did the work. I was learning that this work was not valued in a formal sense. No one paid the women who worked in the church kitchen. No one gave them credit in a public way. No one acknowledged the skill and time that they gave. And yet the work was absolutely necessary. The community could not function without it. What I did not understand at the time, what I could only understand later, was that I was witnessing the maintenance of African American community life during a period when that community was under pressure in multiple ways. The neighborhood was changing, jobs were unstable, families were struggling, but the church, and particularly the women of the church, were maintaining a space where people could gather, where they could be cared for, where they could be assured that they belonged. This was not a small thing. This was the work of survival and of hope. I also did not understand at the time that this work would become less visible as time went on. I did not understand that the church kitchen dinners would become less frequent, that the money would run short, that fewer women would have the time and the energy to do this work. I did not understand that I was witnessing something that was being slowly dismantled by forces much larger than any individual could control. I simply participated in it, learning the skills, absorbing the values, becoming part of the tradition. What I carry with me now is the memory of that kitchen, the smell of it, the feel of it, the particular way that women moved through it and cared for each other and cared for the neighborhood. I carry the memory of hands working, of vegetables being transformed into food, of the simple act of gathering around a table to eat together and to know that you were part of a community that cared about you. I carry the understanding that this work, the daily, unglamorous, undervalued work of maintaining community, is sacred work. It is the work that holds people together. It is the work that transmits values from one generation to the next. It is the work that says, without saying it explicitly, that you matter, that your presence matters, that we will take care of each other because that is what community means. And I carry the gratitude for the women who did that work, for my mother, who gave her time and her skill, for Mrs. Wilson and the other women who had been doing this work for decades, who knew how to manage the work without being asked, who maintained standards without being harsh, who included everyone while also maintaining boundaries about what the church could realistically do. Years later, when I tried to express gratitude to my mother for all the time she had given to the church kitchen, she dismissed it in a way that was characteristic of her. She said that it was simply what you did, that it was part of being part of a community. She did not see it as a sacrifice. She saw it as a natural expression of who she was and what she believed about what community required. But I see it differently now. I see it as the work of resistance and of hope. I see it as the work of maintaining something valuable in the face of forces that wanted to dismantle it. I see it as the work of my mother and women like her, women who gave their time and their skill and their care to ensure that community did not disappear, that people were fed and were cared for, that there was a place where you belonged.